Thank you, everybody, for coming. Feel free to come closer if you want to. We're not like totally filling up the room. Also, feel free to stay where you are if you want. Anyway, I'm going to talk about how open source companies win. The reason that I wanted to do this talk is because there's a lot of conversation about how open source companies don't win, like all the risks that they run and how to manage them. And I thought, well, why on earth would you build an open source company in the first place if it's so risk fraught? Well, it turns out there actually are some advantages. I'm going to talk about those. Okay, so just a quick introduction to who I am. I'm Emily Omier. So I do strategy consulting with open source companies focused on positioning and product strategy. I host a podcast. I host Open Source Founder Summit with Rémi Berthaud, who is a co-founder of Passbolt. And I'm sort of drawing on all of these things to put together this talk and talk about some of the things that open source companies do and the ways that they can crush it in their market. Okay. So the first one is that you can lean into open source as a marketing. A lot of people don't like to talk about this, and also this has to be done subtly. So if you approach your open source community and you just think of it like very transactionally, this is nothing but but a marketing channel, and we're just trying to convert a portion of our open source community, generally that doesn't work. But there are a lot of other ways that open source works as part of your marketing funnel. Okay, so here I have some specific quotes from people that I've had on my podcast about how open source communities can be a part of your marketing funnel. I will let you read those. I really like the quote about Microsoft because there are a lot of companies that are not quote unquote open source companies, but that nonetheless do open source. And they do it not because they're open source hippies. Nobody thinks that Microsoft is run by open source hippies, but rather because they see business benefits from doing so that come as a result of their involvement with open source. Okay, so I actually wanted to, as sort of an illustration, talk about how open source can help throughout the entire marketing funnel. So awareness, this is obvious. A lot of companies do have their open source project precisely so that people can be more aware of the fact that their product and their company exists. This is something it's pretty well known that this happens. In order for it to work, you have to make sure that when you do your open source, or when you get open source users, they're actually aware, that keyword, that there is a company behind it. And that's actually where a lot of open source companies struggle, is creating the link between their open source project and their commercial product, whatever kind it is. So open source absolutely helps with awareness. Consideration, yes, having an open source project can also help at this stage of your marketing funnel because people are going to be able to use your project without having to talk to you, play around with it, compare it to other people, or compare it to other options, and you can gain a lot of trust. So as we move down the marketing funnel, your open source project can help as well. Conversion, so depending, again, on what market you're in, being an open source company, having your open source project can help as well. Mostly because it builds trust with potential customers who might want to be able to be reassured that if something happens to your company, they will be able to fork your project and go on about their merry way. If something happens to your company, they will be okay. It's a risk whenever you start using and you start depending on a software. Also, they're able to see your code, make sure that you actually do what you say you do, and you do not do the things that you say you do not do. One of the things that I think is actually really interesting is the things that happen after somebody becomes either a user or a customer, which is in the loyalty and advocacy stage, quote unquote. So one of the things that having an open source component does really well for companies is it creates loyalty, and it makes people be sort of emotionally invested in your project in a way I think it's very, very rare for you to find in pure commercial software plays. And it also gives users in particular, but also commercial customers, more motivation to do things like go to conferences and give talks about your project or your product without being even pushed by you to do so. So absolutely, open source companies can really take advantage of this, and it's one of the ways they can win in their markets. Okay, do a land grab. This is related. So one of the ways open source can really help companies, particularly if you're in like a dev tool space, is allowing you to completely crush all of your competitors and get a huge market share. Now, this isn't obvious in terms of, or doesn't always mean that you're going to be able to convert it into massive revenue, but it sure helps. So we have a lot of quotes here. Again, of people, founders of relatively successful open source companies talking about the advantages that open source gives you when it comes to being able to quickly get a massive market share and a massive mind share as well, in a way that would probably not be possible if you just had a commercial product. And this is one of the huge advantages of that open source has. It removes a huge amount of friction to getting people started using your project and making people aware that it exists. Okay, radically change your space. Again, particularly in the dev tools market, but not necessarily exclusively, if you want to radically change the paradigm, going open source is the way to do it. It goes with the idea of making a land grab, and it goes with the idea of totally dominating your market. It is hard to do if you are going to have a pure commercial product. If Docker had not been open source, for example, would it have been used by so many developers around the world? Probably not. There would just be way more friction. So if that's part of your strategy, then it totally makes sense to take an open source approach. And if you're going to try to radically change your space, A, you want to do an open source approach. B, this has huge advantages in terms of building a company that's going to have staying power and that's going to really build a movement around what it's doing. Okay, really listen to your users and your communities. So this will help you not just in terms of marketing, but also building a better product. Sometimes people talk about open source as being a distribution model. Others talk about it as a development model. And if you have an open source component as part of your company that you're building a product on top of, you have this advantage to having a direct line of communication with a huge number of users. You have to take advantage of that. But if you can, and if you can really listen to what your users and your community are saying, this is going to give you a huge advantage compared to companies that do not have it. So one of the quotes that really stuck out at me from this is from the founder of Spring, Rod Johnson, who was talking about how they failed for a long time to monetize Spring effectively because they were trying to do the things that they thought were interesting and not the things that their community was trying to tell them that they wanted. And the minute they really listened to what was going on in their community and what people were talking about wanting, they were able to build a commercial product that people actually were willing to pay for. Okay, get people to trust you. We as humans like to do business with people that we trust. Having an open source component to your company is a huge advantage if you're trying to build trust. First of all, you're not asking people to trust you. You're showing them, hey, you don't have to actually trust me. If you want to verify that I do everything that I say I do, go ahead and look at the code yourself. This is a really big deal when we're talking about paranoid customers. But it can be a big deal even when you're not talking about particularly paranoid customers. Now, the other thing about open source, of course, the collaborative nature, if you can really nurture that in your community, Not only does that build trust, but it also builds that emotional investment from members of your community so that they are rooting for you in a way that they probably would not be if you just had a pure commercial play. Obviously, another way to get trust is to have tons of users. So if you have tons of users, but you're a relatively new company, this can definitely be a way to communicate that you're serious. Okay, you can also take a stand. There are all sorts of decisions that go into building software. There are technical decisions, there are marketing decisions. When you have an open source project, all of those decisions are public. And if you take a stand, you're able to say to people in your community, this is what we believe. Now, when I say this is what we believe, this doesn't have to be like a political stand. Often it's a technical choice. We believe that the correct way to approach this kind of problem is X. This will simultaneously repel people who do not agree with you, but what's more important is it will attract those that do. And this creates this community effect, this feeling of being with people who believe in the same thing that you do that you would not find in a pure commercial play. And that can be really powerful. Also, it can be really powerful for your team because your team is going to feel like they're not just building a product and taking home a paycheck, but they're fighting the good fight. They're advancing something that they really think is the right way to do things. Okay, this is the last point. You want to build a product that does not compete with your project and that people will pay money for. Now, when I say that it does not compete with your project, sometimes there is overlap, but you should ideally be able to feel like you're so clear on what the differentiation is between the two that there's not really a huge competition. You're not losing sleep over the fact that your open source project is taking away customers from your commercial product. And that is what allows you to really put the gas on building adoption for your open source project, which is frequently how open source companies win. Okay. Those are a couple of quotes. You can read faster than I can read aloud. But the point is, you really need that clear differentiation. As a company that has an open source project, you have a huge advantage in terms of being able to listen to your customers and build the product that they actually want and are actually prepared to pay for. Okay, so in a nutshell, the things I want you to take away, you should use open source as a distribution model. You should use open source as a development model. You should take your community's trust really seriously and work towards building it and absolutely avoid any situations where you're going to erode that trust. And you should make sure that you have enough differentiation between your product and your project. If you can do those things as an open source company, you can absolutely crush your competition in your market and use open source to your advantage. And that is it. Thank you so much. You can see all the places to connect with me there.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So if we could get our panelists to start making your way towards the stage. Luis, Emily, and